The Galactic Council chambers buzzed with the familiar sounds of interspecies politics. Representatives from hundreds of worlds sat in their designated areas, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and electromagnetic pulses that the universal translators worked overtime to process. At the center of it all, the Zephyrian Empire's delegation commanded attention with their imposing 7-foot frames and crystalline exoskeletons that caught the chamber's ambient light. Admiral Vex High of the Zephyrian fleet stood at the podium, his 4 arms gesturing dramatically as he addressed the assembly. His voice carried the arrogance that had made his species both feared and despised across the galaxy. Esteemed members of the Council, Vex High began, his translator converting his harsh chittering into smooth galactic standard. We gather today to discuss the laughable petition from the species that calls itself humanity. They seek recognition as a Class 7 military power and request permission to establish colonies in the Outer Rim territories. A ripple of what could only be described as laughter moved through the Zephyrian delegation. The sound was unsettling to most species present, like glass breaking in rhythm. These soft-skinned creatures, Vex High continued, who have barely mastered faster-than-light travel, who possess no natural weapons, no protective carapace, no psychic abilities, no enhanced strength, dare to claim they deserve the same status as species that have conquered star systems while their ancestors were still discovering fire. The human delegation sat in uncomfortable silence. There were only 3 of them present, a stark contrast to the dozens of representatives most major powers brought to council sessions. Ambassador Elena Rodriguez maintained her composure, though her knuckles had gone white as she gripped her datapad. Beside her, General Marcus Thompson's weathered face showed no emotion. But those who knew him would recognize the dangerous stillness that had preceded many of his battlefield victories. The 3rd member of their delegation was someone most of the council had barely noticed, a young woman in a simple military uniform with lieutenant's stripes. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had been included in the delegation almost as an afterthought. At 26, she was young for such an important diplomatic mission, but her service record spoke volumes. What most of the alien representatives didn't know was that Sarah held the record for the longest confirmed kill in human military history, a record that had been classified at the highest levels. Look at them. Admiral Vex High gestured toward the human delegation with one of his lower arms. They send children to speak with warriors. Their largest representative barely reaches the chest of our smallest soldier. Their weapons are primitive projectile devices that would barely scratch our armor. Their ships are slow, clunky affairs that lack any sophisticated weaponry. More chittering laughter from the Zephyrian section. Several other species joined in with their own forms of amusement. The Corvan delegation, massive bear-like creatures with natural armor plating, rumbled their approval. The ethereal collective, beings of pure energy, who viewed physical forms as quaint, pulsed with what their translators indicated as condescending agreement. Ambassador Rodriguez finally stood, her movement sharp and precise. Honorable council members, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Humanity may be new to the galactic stage, but we have proven ourselves capable of what? Vex High interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. Your species has been monitoring the galaxy for decades through primitive radio telescopes. Yet you only achieved interstellar travel 15 years ago. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 47 systems before your species had invented written language. The Admiral activated a holographic display that showed various species arranged in what was clearly a hierarchy of military might. At the top were the Zephyrians, followed by the Corvans, the Ethereal Collective, and dozens of other species. At the very bottom, highlighted in what was unmistakably meant to be a mocking color, was humanity. Your combat doctrine, Vex High continued, relies heavily on what you call tactics and strategy, because you lack the natural advantages that make such things unnecessary. When you possess claws that can rend metal, when your carapace can withstand plasma fire, When you can move objects with thought alone, why would you need to hide behind cover and snipe at your enemies from a distance? The word snipe was delivered with particular venom, as if the very concept was distasteful to the Admiral. Lieutenant Sarah Chen shifted slightly in her seat. It was barely perceptible, but General Thompson noticed. He had seen that same movement countless times on the battlefield, Sarah adjusting her position to get a better angle on her target. Even in a diplomatic setting, her instincts remained sharp. The Zephyrian Empire has reviewed humanity's military history, the Admiral continued, pulling up more holographic displays. Your greatest conflicts involved members of your own species. You've never faced a truly alien threat. You have no experience with enemies who can phase through matter, who regenerate from near-fatal wounds, or who can predict your movements through psychic abilities. The displays showed edited footage from human conflicts carefully selected to show what appeared to be chaotic, disorganized fighting. What Vex High didn't show were the strategic masterpieces, the victories against impossible odds, the innovations born from necessity that had shaped human military doctrine. Furthermore, Vex High's tone grew even more dismissive. Your species insists on protecting non-combatants, on following what you call rules of engagement, on showing mercy to defeated enemies. Such sentimentality has no place in real warfare. When the Zephyrian Empire conquers a world, we do so completely and efficiently. There are no civilians, no prisoners, no complicated moral codes to slow our advance. General Thompson's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He had fought in the Titan War, where human forces had held off 3 times their number for 6 months to allow civilian evacuation. He had seen soldiers die protecting supply convoys carrying medicine to refugee camps. The idea that mercy was weakness went against everything he had learned in 40 years of military service. But perhaps, Admiral Vex High said with what could only be interpreted as cruel amusement, we are being too harsh on these newcomers. After all, every species must start somewhere. The Council could grant humanity provisional status as a Class II defensive power. They could serve as suppliers, perhaps. Their manufacturing capabilities, while primitive, might prove useful for producing basic equipment. The suggestion was met with approving sounds from several delegations. It was the galactic equivalent of offering someone a job sweeping floors after they had applied to be a chief executive. Ambassador Rodriguez stood again, her diplomatic training warring with her growing anger. The humans of Earth have faced extinction-level events and survived. We have fought wars that spanned continents and lasted years. We have built civilizations from nothing and reached for the stars despite having no natural advantages beyond our minds and our determination. Determination, Vex High repeated mockingly. Yes, we have heard of this human concept. You believe that wanting something badly enough will somehow overcome superior firepower, better armor, and advanced technology. It is quaint, in the way that a child's belief in fairy tales is quaint. Sarah Chen's hand moved to her sidearm not in any threatening way, but in the unconscious gesture of a soldier who had spent years with a weapon as an extension of herself. The movement was noticed by the Zephyrian security detail, who shifted slightly in response. Perhaps, Vex High suggested with mock generosity, humanity would benefit from a demonstration of real military capability. The Zephyrian Empire would be willing to conduct joint training exercises with human forces. We could show you how warfare is properly conducted by a superior species. The suggestion sent murmurs through the chamber. Joint training exercises between species of vastly different classifications were rare and usually served more as demonstrations of dominance than actual learning opportunities. General Thompson leaned forward slightly. He had been quiet throughout the proceedings, but now his strategic mind was working. A demonstration could work both ways. The Zephyrians were clearly expecting to humiliate humanity in front of the entire galactic community, but they were making assumptions based on incomplete information. The Zephyrian Empire proposes, Vex High announced formally, a military exercise to be conducted in 3 phases. First, a tactical assault scenario where human forces attempt to capture a defended position held by Zephyrian troops. Second, a defensive scenario, where humans attempt to hold a position against Zephyrian assault. Third, individual combat demonstrations between champions from each species. He paused, his four eyes scanning the human delegation with undisguised contempt. Of course, we understand if humanity feels unprepared for such a challenge. There would be no shame in admitting that your species requires more time to develop before attempting to compete with established galactic powers. The chamber fell silent. Every representative present understood that this was more than just a training exercise proposal. It was a formal challenge. Refusing would essentially confirm humanity's second-class status in the galactic community. Accepting could lead to a humiliating defeat that would set human diplomatic efforts back decades. Ambassador Rodriguez looked to General Thompson, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Then both of them looked to Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who had been silently studying the Zephyrian delegation throughout the proceedings. Sarah stood slowly, her movement precise and controlled. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but clear enough to carry throughout the chamber. On behalf of the human military, we accept your challenge. The reaction was immediate. Chittering laughter from the Zephyrians, surprised rumbles from other delegations, and a few sounds that the translators struggled to convert but clearly indicated shock. Admiral Vexhi's four eyes focused on Sarah with something approaching amusement. And who, exactly, will represent humanity in these exercises? Sarah's response was simple and delivered without emotion. I will. The laughter from the Zephyrian delegation intensified. To them, the idea that this small, young human female could present any challenge to their warriors was absurd beyond measure. Very well, Vexhi said, still chittering with amusement. Let it not be said that the Zephyrian Empire is unsporting. We accept your champion. The exercises will be conducted on Kepler 442b, a neutral world with varied terrain suitable for comprehensive testing. Each side will have 1 month to prepare. As the council session concluded and representatives began filing out, Sarah remained seated, while Ambassador Rodriguez and General Thompson handled the final diplomatic arrangements. She was already thinking about Kepler 442b, running calculations in her head about gravity differences, atmospheric composition, and sight lines. What the Zephyrians didn't know was that Sarah Chen had earned her lieutenant's bars in the most demanding training programs humanity had ever devised. She had been trained not just to fight humans, but to adapt to any environment, any enemy, any situation. Her longest confirmed kill had been made in a sandstorm at 3 kilometers distance, accounting for wind, planetary rotation, and target movement patterns. But more importantly, what Admiral Vexhi and his delegation had failed to understand was that humanity's greatest weapon had never been strength or natural armor or psychic abilities. It had always been adaptability, innovation, and the refusal to accept defeat even when victory seemed impossible. As the human delegation prepared to leave the council chambers, Sarah caught sight of Admiral Vexhi watching her with those four eyes. The expression on his crystalline features was still one of amused condescension, as if he were observing an interesting but ultimately harmless insect. Sarah allowed herself a small, cold smile. In 1 month, on a world neither species had ever fought on before, she would teach the Zephyrian Empire something about human determination that no amount of natural armor could protect them from. The galaxy was about to learn why human snipers were feared even by other humans. Kepler 442b hung in space like a jewel of contradictions. The planet's surface featured everything from frozen tundra to scorching deserts, from dense forests to mountain ranges that scraped the edge of space itself. It was the perfect testing ground for military exercises, which was exactly why the Galactic Council had designated it as a neutral training world decades ago. The human preparation base was a study in organized efficiency. Unlike the massive, imposing structures that most galactic species preferred, the human facility was modular, practical, and designed for rapid deployment and breakdown. General Thompson had insisted on bringing minimal support staff, just 12 specialists, who would handle logistics, communications, and equipment maintenance. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the base's perimeter, studying the terrain through a pair of enhanced binoculars. The landscape before her was unlike anything on Earth, but her training had prepared her for exactly this kind of adaptation challenge. The gravity was slightly heavier than Earth standard, the atmospheric pressure was higher, and the planet's longer rotation meant extended periods of both daylight and darkness. The Zephyrians have set up their base 18 kilometers north of here, reported Sergeant Maria Santos, approaching with a datapad in hand. Santos was one of the 12 support staff, a communications specialist who had worked with Sarah on 3 previous campaigns. Our satellites show they've brought approximately 200 personnel and enough equipment to outfit a small army. Sarah lowered her binoculars and turned to face Santos. 200 against 13, she mused. Those are almost fair odds. Santos grinned despite herself. She had seen Sarah work before, had watched her turn impossible situations into victories through a combination of skill, preparation, and what could only be described as supernatural patience. The first phase of the exercise would begin in 72 hours. The scenario was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. Human forces would attempt to capture and hold a fortified position currently occupied by Zephyrian troops. The target was a communications array built into a rocky outcrop, approximately 8 kilometers from the human base. What made the challenge particularly difficult was that the Zephyrians had been given 2 weeks to establish their defensive position, while humanity had only been on planet for 3 days. In conventional military thinking, attackers needed a significant numerical advantage to overcome prepared defenders. Sarah's force was outnumbered, 15 to 1. General Thompson emerged from the command module, his expression thoughtful. At 62, he had learned to trust his instincts, and those instincts were telling him that the Zephyrians were overconfident to the point of carelessness. "The enemy commander is Sub-Admiral Kex Thor," he announced to the assembled team. "According to our intelligence files, he's considered one of their finest tactical minds. 47 victories, no defeats. He's also Admiral Vex High's younger brother." Sarah absorbed this information without visible reaction. Family connections often meant additional pressure to perform, but they could also lead to emotional decision-making. She filed the information away for later consideration. "What's our intelligence on their defensive capabilities?" asked Lieutenant Commander David Park, the team's technology specialist. Park was responsible for maintaining Sarah's specialized equipment and ensuring their communication systems remained undetected. "Standard Zephyrian defensive doctrine," Thompson replied, activating a holographic display of the target area. Multiple overlapping fields of fire, energy barriers at key choke points, and automated defense turrets. Their troops will be positioned in crystalline bunkers that can withstand significant explosive force. The hologram showed the communications array perched on top of a rocky hill with steep approaches on 3 sides. The 4th side featured a gradual slope that was obviously intended to channel attackers into a kill zone covered by interlocking defensive positions. "They're expecting a frontal assault," Sarah observed, studying the display intently. Multiple small unit attacks to probe their defenses, followed by a concentrated push up the accessible slope. "That would be standard human doctrine against a prepared position," Thompson agreed. "Which is exactly why we're not going to do it." Sarah spent the next 48 hours in intensive preparation. While her team handled logistics and equipment setup, she focused on what had made her the most effective sniper in human military history, understanding her environment and her enemy with obsessive precision. She studied atmospheric data, wind patterns, temperature variations, and the unique properties of Kepler 442b's longer day-night cycle. She memorized topographical maps, calculated sightlines and firing angles, and identified potential hide sites within range of the target. But most importantly, she studied every available piece of intelligence on Zephyrian physiology and psychology. Zephyrians were formidable opponents by almost any measure. Their crystalline exoskeletons could deflect most standard projectile weapons and provided significant protection against energy weapons. They possessed 4 arms, allowing them to manipulate multiple weapons simultaneously, and their sensory capabilities included electromagnetic perception that could detect most forms of electronic equipment at considerable distances. However, every species had weaknesses, and Sarah had learned to exploit weaknesses that others might not even recognize. The Zephyrian exoskeleton, while providing excellent protection, had joints that were necessarily more flexible. Their electromagnetic perception, while impressive, could be overwhelmed by properly configured interference. Most significantly, their combat doctrine relied heavily on overwhelming firepower and direct confrontation. They had little experience with enemies who refused to engage on their terms. On the morning of the first exercise, representatives from dozens of species gathered at observation points around the designated combat zone. The Galactic Council had decided to make the exercises public, partly as entertainment and partly as an educational opportunity for smaller species to observe advanced military tactics. Admiral HFY stood at the primary observation platform, his 4 eyes focused on displays showing both human and Zephyrian positions. Beside him, Sub-Admiral Thor's image appeared on a communication screen, transmitted from his command bunker at the target site. "Brother," Thor said, his voice carrying confidence and amusement. "I must admit, I am curious to see what these humans consider military tactics. Our defensive sensors show only 13 heat signatures at their base camp. Are they planning to surrender without engaging? Perhaps they hope to impress us with their surrender ceremony," HFY replied, eliciting chittering laughter from the surrounding Zephyrian observers. What the Zephyrian sensors were detecting was accurate, but incomplete. There were indeed 13 human heat signatures at the base camp, but 12 of them belonged to support personnel who would play no role in the actual assault. The 13th signature belonged to Sarah Chen, but she was no longer at the base camp. Sarah had departed the human base before dawn, moving through terrain that no Zephyrian would consider passable. Her route took her through a series of narrow canyons and rocky defiles that led not toward the target, but away from it. To any observer, it would appear that the human forces were moving in the wrong direction entirely. The Zephyrian defensive positions were impressive by conventional standards. Energy barriers blocked the obvious approach routes. Automated turrets provided overlapping fields of fire, and crystalline bunkers offered protection for defenders, while allowing them clear lines of sight across the killing ground they had prepared. Sub-Admiral Thor had positioned his forces according to standard doctrine. Heavy weapons, teams covering the primary approach, mobile response units ready to counter any flanking attempts, and reserve forces prepared to reinforce threatened positions. It was a textbook defensive setup that should have been able to handle any conventional assault with minimal casualties. The problem was that Sarah Chen had not spent 8 years becoming humanity's most effective sniper by conducting conventional assaults. At 0800 hours, the exercise officially began. Galactic Council observers watched their displays expectantly, waiting to see how human forces would attempt to overcome the obvious challenges presented by the Zephyrian defensive position. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The Zephyrian defenders remained at their posts, scanning for approaching enemies that never materialized. Their sensors detected no movement toward the target area, no electromagnetic signatures indicating advancing human equipment, no heat signatures suggesting troop concentrations. "Perhaps," Admiral HFY observed dryly, "the humans are still developing their plan of attack." Sub-Admiral Thor was less amused. As a professional military commander, he understood that no competent force would waste time in a training exercise. The humans were doing something, even if Zephyrian sensors couldn't detect it. "Increase sensor sweeps to maximum range," he ordered his communications officer. "If the humans are attempting some form of stealth approach, I want to know about it." What Thor didn't realize was that Sarah was already had been in position for over an hour. Her hide site was located in a rocky outcrop nearly 4 kilometers from the target, well beyond the range that any reasonable commander would consider relevant to the engagement. Sarah's position offered several advantages that the Zephyrians had not anticipated. The range was beyond their sensor sweep patterns. The angle of approach created a blind spot in their defensive coverage, and the rocky terrain provided natural concealment that their electromagnetic detection systems couldn't penetrate. More importantly, Sarah's position allowed her to observe the Zephyrian defenses in detail, without being observed in return. Through her enhanced scope, she could see individual defenders at their posts, study their movement patterns, and identify command personnel by their behavior and equipment. At 1030 hours, Sub-Admiral Kex Thor made his first mistake. Growing impatient with the lack of activity, he decided to conduct an active sensor sweep of the surrounding area. The sweep involved temporarily lowering the energy barriers that protected key defensive positions while powerful detection systems searched for hidden enemies. The sweep lasted exactly 43 seconds. During that time, the energy barrier protecting the command bunker was reduced to allow sensor arrays to operate at full power. Sarah's rifle was a masterpiece of human engineering, specifically designed for extreme-range precision shooting in hostile environments. The weapon used electromagnetically accelerated projectiles that could adjust their flight path in real time to compensate for atmospheric conditions, gravitational variations, and target movement. From her position, 4 kilometers away, through atmospheric conditions, she had spent 2 days calculating. Sarah acquired her target. Sub-Admiral Kex Thor stood at the command station in his bunker, his 4 arms manipulating multiple control interfaces as he monitored the sensor sweep results. His crystalline exoskeleton gleamed under the bunker's internal lighting, and his 4 eyes focused intently on the tactical displays, showing the area around his defensive position. Sarah's shot was calculated to account for the planet's gravity, atmospheric density, wind patterns at multiple altitudes, the rotation of Kepler 442b, and the specific vulnerabilities of Zephyrian anatomy. The projectile's flight time was 4.7 seconds. The round struck Sub-Admiral Kex Thor at the joint between his main carapace and his neck section, one of the few points where Zephyrian anatomy was truly vulnerable. The impact was precisely calculated to disable without causing permanent injury, as required by the exercise rules. The command bunker erupted in confusion as their commanding officer collapsed, clearly eliminated from the exercise. Automated systems immediately began announcing a change of command, promoting the senior tactical officer to acting commander. On the observation platform, Admiral Vex High stared at his displays in stunned silence. His brother had been eliminated by an enemy that none of their sensors had detected, from a distance that should have been impossible for any projectile weapon to accurately engage. How? He demanded of his technical staff. How did they achieve that shot? But Sarah was already moving to her secondary position. Phase 1 of her plan was complete. The enemy command structure was disrupted. Phase 2 would require a different approach and a different position. The acting Zephyrian commander, Major Hexval, was competent but lacked his predecessor's experience. His first instinct was to increase defensive vigilance and expand sensor coverage. But Sarah had anticipated this reaction. Her second position was closer to the target, only 2 kilometers away, but approached from an entirely different angle. While Zephyrian forces searched for threats from the direction of the first shot, Sarah was establishing a firing position that would allow her to engage their secondary command post. The mathematics of her next shot were even more complex. The target was partially concealed behind energy barriers. The angle required her projectile to travel through 3 distinct atmospheric layers with different density characteristics, and the target would be moving within a limited space. At 1,147 hours, Sarah fired her second shot. Major Hexval was coordinating with his artillery commanders when the round found him. Again, striking a joint section of his exoskeleton with precision that rendered him unable to continue the exercise. The Zephyrian defensive position was now without effective command leadership. Their automated systems were struggling to maintain coordination between separate defensive units, and their troops were beginning to show signs of the psychological pressure that came from facing an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't detect, and couldn't engage. From his observation platform, Admiral Vex High watched in growing horror as his supposedly superior forces were systematically dismantled by a single human soldier who remained completely invisible to their sensors. Sarah's third position brought her to within 1 kilometer of the target, close enough to engage individual defensive positions with rapid precision. Her rifle's ammunition supply allowed for sustained fire, and her targeting system had identified 17 critical defensive positions that needed to be neutralized. Over the next 90 minutes, Sarah systematically eliminated key Zephyrian defenders with shots that seemed to come from impossible angles at impossible ranges. Energy barrier operators, artillery spotters, communications personnel, and tactical coordinators fell one after another to projectiles that arrived without warning from directions their sensors indicated should be empty. By 1400 hours, the Zephyrian defensive position was in complete chaos. Automated systems were attempting to coordinate defenses without organic oversight. Surviving personnel were taking cover instead of manning their positions, and the carefully planned defensive layout had become a collection of isolated strong points with no unified command. At 1,427 hours, Sarah Chen walked up the main approach to the communications array, her rifle slung across her back and her hands clearly visible. The remaining Zephyrian defenders, fewer than 30 of the original 200, watched in stunned silence as she approached the position they had spent 2 weeks fortifying. She entered the primary command bunker, activated the communications array, and transmitted the required signal, indicating successful capture of the objective. The exercise was over. Humanity had won the first phase. In the silence that followed, Admiral Vex High found himself staring at displays showing a single human soldier standing in a position that 200 of his finest troops had been unable to hold against her. For the first time in his military career, Vex High began to suspect that the Zephyrian Empire might have seriously underestimated their new neighbors from the planet called Earth. The second phase of the exercise began 72 hours after Sarah's stunning victory in the assault scenario. This time, the roles were reversed. Human forces would defend a position, while Zephyrian troops attempted to capture it. Admiral Vex High had personally taken command of the Zephyrian assault force, bringing with him 300 of the Empire's elite shock troopers. The defensive position was a mining complex built into the side of a mountain, featuring multiple levels connected by narrow passages and offering excellent fields of fire across the approaches. It was the kind of defensive position that military theorists used in textbooks to illustrate the advantages of prepared defenders over attacking forces. Sarah stood on the complex's highest observation deck, studying the valley below through her scope. The terrain offered several possible approach routes, but all of them would require Zephyrian forces to cross open ground under direct observation from the defenders. "They'll probe our defenses first," General Thompson observed, joining Sarah at the observation point. "Standard doctrine would be to test our response patterns, identify weak points, then concentrate their forces for a decisive assault." Sarah nodded without lowering her scope. "Admiral Vex High is too smart to underestimate us again. He'll bring overwhelming force to bear and try to minimize our advantages." What neither of them said aloud was that 13 humans defending against 300 attackers was a scenario that no military doctrine considered viable. The mathematics were simple. Even if every human defender eliminated 23 Zephyrian attackers without taking a single casualty, the position would still fall. But Sarah Chen had built her reputation on making impossible mathematics work in humanity's favor. The defensive complex had been modified according to Sarah's specifications during the preparation period. The changes were subtle but significant. Additional firing positions that appeared to be standard defensive emplacements but offered unexpected angles of fire, concealed movement routes that would allow defenders to relocate without being observed, and most importantly, a series of camouflaged positions external to the main complex that could serve as advanced observation posts. "Admiral Vex High will expect us to concentrate our forces in the main defensive positions," Sarah explained to her team during their final briefing. "He'll plan his assault based on standard defensive doctrine because that's what every other species would do." Sergeant Santos studied the tactical displays with professional interest. "But we're not going to concentrate our forces in the main positions. The main complex will be defended by automated systems and decoy signatures," Sarah confirmed. "Our actual defensive positions will be external to the complex, positioned to engage attacking forces from angles they won't anticipate." It was a high-risk strategy that depended entirely on mobility, precision, and the ability to engage superior forces without being detected or overwhelmed. In conventional military thinking, it was borderline suicidal. Lieutenant Commander Park raised a practical concern. If we're operating outside the main defensive perimeter, we'll have limited ammunition resupply and no heavy weapon support. We'll be depending entirely on individual marksmanship and tactical movement. Sarah's smile was cold and confident. Admiral Vexhai is about to learn why human soldiers are taught to make every shot count. On the morning of the second exercise, Zephyrian forces began their approach with textbook precision. Admiral Vexhai had divided his 300 troops into 3 assault groups, each supported by mobile artillery and energy weapons teams. His plan was straightforward. Simultaneous attacks, from multiple directions, to overwhelm the human defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Reconnaissance drones swept the approaches to the mining complex, mapping defensive positions and identifying firing lanes. The drones detected what appeared to be standard defensive preparations: energy barriers, automated turrets, and heat signatures indicating human defenders at expected positions within the complex. What the drones failed to detect were the 12 human soldiers positioned in carefully camouflaged hides scattered across the mountainside, each one occupying a position that offered overlapping fields of fire across the Zephyrian approach routes. Sarah's position was the most advanced, located in a rocky outcrop, barely 800 meters from the primary Zephyrian assembly area. From her hide, she could observe Admiral Vexhai's command post and monitor the coordination of the assault forces. At 0900 hours, the Zephyrian assault began. The first phase was a coordinated artillery barrage, designed to suppress the defensive positions and clear obstacles from the assault routes. Energy weapons and explosive projectiles rained down on the mining complex, targeting the positions where Zephyrian sensors indicated human defenders were concentrated. The barrage was impressive and would have been devastating against conventional defensive positions. Energy barriers overloaded and collapsed, automated turrets were destroyed by direct hits, and several sections of the complex suffered significant structural damage. But the human defenders weren't in the positions being targeted. As the artillery barrage lifted and Zephyrian assault troops began their advance across the open ground below the complex, Sarah's voice crackled over the communications network, connecting the scattered human positions. All units, this is Overwatch. Targets are advancing into engagement range. Wait for my signal. Admiral Vexhai watched his assault unfold from his command position with professional satisfaction. The artillery had clearly suppressed the human defenses, and his troops were advancing according to plan. Thermal imaging showed minimal movement from the defensive positions, suggesting that the humans were either eliminated or suppressing themselves to avoid further bombardment. The first Zephyrian assault group reached the base of the mining complex without encountering resistance. Squad leaders reported successful breaches of the outer perimeter and began advancing toward the main defensive positions. That was when Sarah gave the signal. All units, engage. The mountainside erupted in precisely coordinated fire as 12 human soldiers opened up on the Zephyrian assault forces from positions that shouldn't have existed according to any tactical analysis the Zephyrians had conducted. Sarah's first target was a Zephyrian squad leader, directing his troops toward what he believed was an unmanned defensive position. Her shot struck him center mass, the electromagnetically accelerated projectile punching through his crystalline armor at the joint where mobility required flexibility. Across the battlefield, 11 other human soldiers engaged targets with the methodical precision that defined human military doctrine. Each shot was calculated. Each target was chosen for maximum tactical impact, and each engagement was conducted from a position that offered concealment and multiple escape routes. The effect on the Zephyrian assault was immediate and devastating. Squad leaders fell to precise fire from directions their reconnaissance had indicated were empty. Communications personnel were eliminated before they could coordinate responses to the unexpected threat. Heavy weapons teams found themselves under attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Admiral Vexhai stared at his tactical displays in growing disbelief as his assault forces began reporting contact with enemy positions that hadn't appeared on any of their reconnaissance sweeps. His carefully planned advance was dissolving into chaos as his troops sought cover from an enemy they couldn't locate or engage. Second and third assault groups, advance immediately, he ordered, attempting to maintain the momentum of his attack. Concentrate fire on the ridge positions and provide covering fire for the first group. But Sarah had anticipated this response. As Zephyrian forces moved to flank what they believed were the human firing positions, they exposed themselves to engagement from additional concealed positions that Sarah's team had established specifically to counter such tactics. Sergeant Santos, positioned in a hide overlooking the northern approach route, engaged the second assault group with devastating precision. Her position offered perfect enfilade fire across their line of advance, and her targeting system had identified the optimal sequence for engaging multiple targets in rapid succession. Lieutenant Commander Park, hidden among the rocky outcrops on the southern slope, found himself in perfect position to engage Zephyrian heavy weapons teams as they attempted to maneuver for better firing positions. His shots systematically eliminated the crews of mobile artillery units and energy weapons platforms. The Zephyrian assault was becoming a massacre. Admiral Vex High's 300 elite troops were being systematically destroyed by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't locate, and couldn't engage. Every attempt to coordinate a response revealed new human positions that had somehow remained invisible to their reconnaissance efforts. "Sir," reported his tactical officer, "we've lost contact with over 60% of the assault force. The remaining units are requesting permission to withdraw and regroup." Vex High's 4 eyes focused intently on the tactical displays, showing the positions of his remaining forces. The humans had somehow established a defensive network that covered every possible approach to their objective while remaining completely undetected by Zephyrian sensors. "Negative," he decided. "All remaining units will advance simultaneously. Maximum speed, no tactical movement. We'll overwhelm them through sheer speed and numbers." It was the desperate decision of a commander who had run out of tactical options, but it was also exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. As the remaining Zephyrian forces abandoned cover and advanced at maximum speed across the open ground below the mining complex, they exposed themselves to the kind of precise, coordinated fire that human military doctrine was designed to deliver. Sarah's voice was calm and professional as she coordinated the final phase of the defense. "All units. Targets are advancing in the open. Engage at will. Make every shot count." The next 7 minutes represented some of the most devastating defensive fire in recorded galactic military history. 12 human soldiers, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across multiple engagement zones, systematically eliminated the remaining Zephyrian assault forces with precision that bordered on mechanical. Sarah herself accounted for 19 confirmed eliminations during those 7 minutes. Her rifle cycling through targets with methodical efficiency. Her shots found gaps in Zephyrian armor, exploited momentary losses of concealment, and anticipated target movement patterns with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. At 0947 hours, the last Zephyrian soldier in the assault force was eliminated by Corporal Rachel Martinez from a position over 1,200 meters from her target. Admiral Vex High stood alone in his command post, staring at tactical displays that showed the complete destruction of his assault force. 300 of the Zephyrian Empire's finest troops had been eliminated by 13 human defenders who had never once been successfully engaged by his forces. Sarah's voice crackled over the communications channel that connected the exercise participants with the observation platforms. "Admiral Vex High, this is Lieutenant Sarah Chen. Your assault force has been eliminated. Do you wish to surrender the exercise, or would you prefer to advance with your command staff?" The question was delivered with professional courtesy, but the implication was clear. Sarah was offering the Admiral the opportunity to surrender rather than face the humiliation of being eliminated by the same human soldier who had single-handedly captured his brother's position in the first exercise. Vex High's response came after a long pause. "Human forces, this is Admiral Vex High. The Zephyrian Empire concedes the second exercise. Your tactical performance has been instructive." The third and final exercise was scheduled for the following day. Individual combat between champions from each species. Originally intended as a demonstration of Zephyrian physical superiority, the event had taken on an entirely different character following the results of the first 2 exercises. Sarah spent the evening preparing for single combat against whatever champion the Zephyrian Empire chose to send against her. The rules were simple. Armed combat, in a designated arena. Victory achieved through elimination of the opponent, according to exercise safety protocols. Her opponent was Subcommander Zektal, a veteran of 37 campaigns and considered one of the finest individual warriors in the Zephyrian military. Standing over 7 feet tall with the characteristic 4 arms and crystalline exoskeleton, he was physically imposing and armed with energy weapons that could punch through most known armor. The arena was a circular space, approximately 100 meters in diameter, featuring varied terrain that included rocky outcrops, shallow depressions, and obstacles that could provide limited cover. Observation platforms around the perimeter were packed with representatives from dozens of species, all eager to see the conclusion of what had become the most discussed military demonstration in recent galactic history. Sarah entered the arena carrying her rifle and sidearm, wearing standard human combat armor that looked primitive compared to Zektal's advanced protective systems. She appeared small and fragile next to her opponent, exactly as Admiral Vex High had described humanity in his original address to the Galactic Council. The combat began at Admiral Vex High's signal. Zektal immediately moved to exploit his advantages, using his superior speed and firepower to attempt to pin Sarah in position while closing for decisive engagement. His energy weapons carved through the arena's obstacles, demonstrating the kind of overwhelming firepower that had made the Zephyrian Empire dominant across multiple star systems. Sarah's response was to disappear, not literally, but with the kind of tactical movement that made her one of the most effective soldiers in human military history. She used the arena's terrain to break line of sight, employed smoke grenades to obscure her movement, and positioned herself to engage from angles that Zektal couldn't anticipate. The engagement became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Zektal pursuing an opponent who refused to fight according to his expectations. Every time he thought he had Sarah pinned down, she would appear in a different location, deliver precise fire that tested his armor's protective capabilities, then disappear again before he could respond effectively. For the galactic observers, it was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Sarah demonstrated principles that most species had never considered. Using mobility to counter superior firepower, exploiting environmental advantages to offset physical disadvantages, and employing patience and precision to wear down a stronger opponent. The decisive moment came when Zektal, frustrated by his inability to pin down his opponent, made the mistake of pursuing Sarah into a section of the arena where his size and 4-armed configuration became disadvantages rather than advantages. Sarah's final shot was fired from a position barely 30 meters from her target, but from an angle that Zektal's sensors had not been monitoring. The electromagnetically accelerated projectile struck him at the precise joint where his exoskeleton connected to his primary neural complex. Zektal collapsed as his armor's systems registered a combat elimination. The arena fell silent as Sarah Chen stood over her defeated opponent, her rifle smoking in the afternoon air of Kepler 442b. Around the observation platforms, representatives from dozens of species stared in stunned silence at the small human female who had just defeated one of the galaxy's most feared warriors in single combat. Admiral Vex High activated his communications system, his voice carrying clearly across the arena and to the observation platforms beyond. The Zephyrian Empire concedes all 3 phases of the military exercise. Lieutenant Sarah Chen of the human military has demonstrated tactical and combat capabilities that exceed our initial assessment of human military potential. He paused, his 4 eyes focused on Sarah as she assisted the eliminated Zektal to his feet, with the courtesy that human military doctrine demanded toward defeated opponents. The Zephyrian Empire formally requests that the Galactic Council grant humanity full, Class 7 military power status, and recognize their petition for colonial expansion rights in the Outer Rim territories. The announcement sent shockwaves through the galactic community. In less than a week, a single human soldier had forced one of the galaxy's most powerful military forces to publicly acknowledge that humanity deserved recognition as an equal rather than a subordinate species. As Sarah left the arena, she passed Admiral Vex High on the observation platform. The Zephyrian commander studied her with what could only be interpreted as professional respect. "Lieutenant Chen," he said formally. "The Zephyrian Empire would be honored to establish military cooperation agreements with humanity. We believe there is much we could learn from your tactical doctrines." Well, Sarah's response was simple and delivered with the quiet confidence that had defined her throughout the exercises. "Admiral, humanity looks forward to working with the Zephyrian Empire as equals in the galactic community." 6 months later, human colonies began establishing themselves in the Outer Rim territories under the protection of expanded military cooperation agreements with multiple galactic powers. The exercises on Kepler 442b had demonstrated that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their physical capabilities, but their ability to adapt, innovate, and achieve victory through superior tactics and unbreakable determination. Sarah Chen was promoted to captain and assigned to lead humanity's first interstellar special operations unit. Her mission: to ensure that no other species ever again made the mistake of underestimating what humans could accomplish when their backs were against the wall. The galaxy had learned to respect humanity, but more importantly, they had learned to fear the quiet professionalism of human soldiers who made every shot count.